So what are the best decks in Hearthstone? Sadly, the best decks are pretty much all aggro, but I'm going to go over all of them anyway because there are a couple on this list that aren't. So if you want to play different strategies, you can. So the first one is going to be Aggro Shadow Priest. Aggro Shadow Priest is the best deck in the game because it is able to snowball extremely quickly, and I think it can end games faster than any other Hearthstone deck right now, and it's probably one of the fastest decks in Hearthstone history if you can get out the Void Touch Attendant. I have legitimately won games lethal turn 4 with this deck on multiple occasions. If you watch the video about this deck I have on my channel, it's really strong, and the general strength of this deck is to snowball a board really quickly, get a lot of little minions out there to get the most damage out of the attendant, pump them up a little bit with the Wriggling Horror, and then eventually finish off your opponent with Mr. Smite, Void Shard, or the Defias Leper. It's extremely strong. Best deck in the game right now with the highest win rate across most ranks, except for maybe Aggro/Beast Druid, which we will get into in just a second. So if you like fun educational content like this, you should like, comment, and subscribe, and ask me any questions if you have them, and then also check out my VODs channel in the description if you want to watch my full unedited streams where you can see more gameplay of wins, losses, and multiple decks. The next deck on the list is Aggro Druid and Beast Druid. I'm only showing Aggro Druid right now, but both will be in the description, and both of them function similarly. One, Aggro Druid is more aggro based. You want to play a lot of minions early, and you want to pull out minions with Drekthar, as well as create a lot of duplicates with Oracle of the Loon, probably around turn 4, 5, and 6. Taunt Druid, on the other hand, is a little bit different, and the idea of that deck is to reduce the cost of two big beasts, being the Umbral Owl and the Frost Saber Matriarch, and then combo that with Oracle of the Loon to get a really big board, usually turn 5 or 6, of just stronger minions. So it's less aggro early and more power mid-game. They both basically try to revolve around the Oracle of the Loon with a surprise board, and both of them are really strong. I would say that it's close between this deck and Aggro Shadow Priest. The win rates kind of go back and forth day to day, but I would recommend trying out one of these two because they're both fairly cheap. And I forgot to mention this for the Aggro Shadow Priest, but you could definitely run this on a budget by taking out the two legendaries and replacing them with two chaplains. The next deck on this list is a little bit weird to be third, but it's Quest Rogue, and even though its win rate is technically lower than Burn Shaman and Face Hunter, I think this deck has more potential than both of those two decks because it's harder to play. And despite the fact that it's harder to play and isn't just a pure aggro deck, slam down minions, only go face all the time, despite that, it still has about 1%, if not 0.5% lower win rate than Burn Shaman and Face Hunter respectively. Overall, I think the deck is extremely good, and even though the Shadowcrafter Scabs nerf did hurt Rogue as a whole, Quest Rogue continues to be a top 5, top 6 deck ever since the nerf, and I think that it goes unnoticed. Like, I don't see this deck played as much as it should be played considering how strong it is. Every time I play it, I do exceptionally well. Like last season, I went 12-5 with it. This season, currently, I'm 7-3 with it. It's good. I would recommend trying it out. The next deck on this list is Burn Shaman, and I think Burn Shaman is a great deck. Not only do you have some decent board presence with things like the Snowfall Guardian and the Brilliant Macaw, as well as just a couple of other small minions and the Wildpaw Cavern, but you also have insane burst damage, which can sometimes do 30 or more damage in any given turn. In fact, I took out one Wind Chill to put in a Diligent Note Taker to increase the reach that you have with damage, because sometimes when I was playing against Ramp Druid, if they played double Cenarian Ward, I'd be like a little bit short of lethal, so I threw in the Diligent Note Taker to get an extra copy of something like Lightning Bolt, and it allowed me to get that extra push in to close out games. That being said, the general idea of this deck is to burn your opponent down because it is called Burn Shaman, and you burn them with cards like Lightning Bolt, Frostbite, and Serpentine Portal, and then Overdraft. Overdraft is actually where a lot of your damage comes from, especially if you play like Lightning Bloom on the same turn as you go off with all of your cards, because if you think about it, Novice Zapper, if you play two of them, a Lightning Bolt, a Lightning Bloom, and a Serpentine Portal, that's 6 damage, not to mention the 2 spell damage you're going to get off of the Novice Zappers with Overdraft. It's a pretty cheap combo for a lot of damage. So Face Hunter is the next deck on this list, and it's a little bit weird to me because it is like the aggro deck that is the jack of all trades but the master of none. Like Aggro Shadow Priest is able to develop an insane board and close out games turn 4 or 5 if you snowball super hard, and then you have things like Burn Shaman, which are fairly aggressive, but also can do 30 plus damage from hand pretty consistently, or at least 20 plus damage from hand pretty consistently. Whereas Face Hunter is more of a pretty good at developing a board and pretty good at burst damage from hand, but doesn't excel at either of them. And because of that, its win rate is slightly lower than the other two decks. As you can actually see right here, Aggro, Shadow Priest, Burn Shaman are both tier 1, and Face Hunter is a little bit below that at tier 2. I do think that it is more flexible because it can go either way in terms of strategies, and if you actually learn how to play the deck, I think it has at least a little more potential than, let's just say, Burn Shaman. But I don't know, I have mixed feelings with this deck. I still like it because Face Hunter is the first deck I ever got to Legend with years ago, and it's still strong now. It's just not as strong at any one thing than the other two aggro decks. And the next deck on the list is the deck all of these aggro decks are aiming to beat. Not only other combo greedy decks, but this is the main one because Spell/Ramp Druid is played about 23% of the time in Ranked right now. As you can see here in Legend, it makes up 23%. In Diamond 3, it makes up 25%. Same in Diamond 5 and 4. It's an extremely popular deck. And I know I'm combining both these stats because Spell Druid and Ramp Druid are basically the same deck with a few minor differences. Anyway, Spell Druid is extremely strong because it's fairly cheap, it has a decent amount of armor so it can actually beat these aggro decks somewhat consistently, especially if you're able to get out an early Scale of Onyxia and wipe their board, especially into like a Shadow Priest. And then you play Kazakusan and you can beat out any deck in the game, right? The treasures close out games against control decks, and they also win you games against aggro decks if you can get them out soon enough and get like a really big removal or heal thing. So it's just a solid deck all around. Double activate your armor spells to survive. You got insane draw with Fungal Fortunes, Capture, Cold Tooth Mine, Moonlit Guidance, and Guff. And then you got good survivability with Taunts and Good Rush. So this is going to be my Dark Horse deck, the one that might not necessarily have the highest win rate, but one that I think is actually extremely good, and that is Owl OTK Warlock. I really enjoyed playing this deck, which is weird to say because most of the time I felt like I was complaining about this deck, but ever since the nerf to Rune Mithrod and the Moarg Artificer, it became a lot slower. And since it's no longer ending games turn like 6 or 7, which was absolutely ridiculous, and it's ending games more around 8 to 10, it's still a fast combo deck that requires a decent amount of setup, multiple cards, and is fast enough to beat Ramp Kazakusan Druid, and has enough removal to deal with aggro decks. I'm not necessarily saying that it is amazing against all these things, and to be quite honest, some aggro decks, if they get an insanely good hand, will probably just overrun you. But the fact is, you have a chance against all of these decks while also having the constant threat of potentially being able to end the game at any point after turn 7. So I really like this deck. I ended up going like 5-0 with it yesterday. It felt really good. I run the Gold Shire Knolls because your hands are usually full, and it's something you could put on the board to apply a little bit of pressure so you don't lose to aggro as hard. And yeah, I really like this deck. Next is Buff Paladin. Buff Paladin is a little bit lower on the list because I don't really like Paladin decks right now. It feels like if people know what they're doing and just kind of kill the minions you put on the board, you're never really able to pump up the minions and win the game. That being said though, this is the best Paladin deck because Libram Paladin has a huge weakness, which is your infinite value from Lady Liadrin and getting a lot of Librams of Wisdom no longer matter. Basically, the treasures from Kazakusan have multiple things that either silence minions, silence and destroy minions, or can destroy minions extremely efficiently. So your big minions you get out there every single turn don't really matter nearly as much, and you don't have a lot of direct damage. Luckily, Buff Paladin has a little bit more tempo because you're putting out minions on the board and then buffing them immediately. You have the Sunwing Squawker, which can, if you combo with Blessing of Authority, can be an 11-12 turn 6, and then you just try to give the biggest thing you can, Wind Fury, and close out games with that or Mr. Smite, and it's usually pretty good. I will say Shaman was a really annoying matchup because of all the freezing, but for the most part, this deck actually ended up doing quite well. So next is Boldner OTK Shaman, and I think this is a pretty good example of what an OTK deck probably should be. I will admit I'm not a fan of the infinite damage. I wish that there was a cap on the damage, so let's just say like a Control Warrior or a Druid could theoretically gain enough armor to sometimes survive. But other than that, I like the fact that you cannot combo with this deck until around turn 9 or 10. You need to have a couple of cards played beforehand. You need to have at least 3 cards in your hand, the Bloom, Bolner, and the Yashiraj. You need to be able to control the board and survive this long. And overall, I actually like this deck a pretty decent amount. It's the deck Disguised Host used to get to Legend after a, like, 2-year retirement. Kind of crazy, but yeah, I really do like this deck. I think that there are some problems, most notably being the lack of healing, so some pure aggro decks can rush you down. But other than that, you're usually fine. Like, if it's against anything more mid-rangey, it just constantly frees their board and they can't really play the game. So it's a solid deck, cool OTK. Not a huge fan of infinite damage, but I'm not a huge fan of infinites in general. And jumping into the next one. And last on the list is Charge Warrior. I really like this deck for several reasons. One, this is like the perfect example of what an OTK should be. It has a damage cap of 54 damage at absolute max. The only way you can do that is with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 cards in hand, maybe 5 if you're able to play the Vander early on in the game, which means you don't need one of the to the fronts. And the less card combo does 36 damage, which only needs 1, 2, 3, 4 cards, but still there is a strict damage cap, so there is counterplay, but it's also really good at controlling the board, so it's able to beat aggro decks pretty consistently. Like, I can't tell you how many aggro druids and face hunters and shadow priests I destroyed with this deck. You just wipe their board early with a minefield, they struggle to get it back, maybe a rancor or brawl later, all while gaining a ton of armor. And there's nothing your opponent can do. And then you either A, close out the game with your combo, or B, aggro decks will concede. It's actually a lot better than I thought this deck was going to be overall, and I would highly recommend trying it. And the last honorable mention deck on this list is Dragon Control Warrior. And the reason it's on here is because I just personally like it a lot. I think this is how Blizzard intended Kazakusan to be played. A hard control deck where you use him once you draw him. You can use him early if you get lucky enough to draw him early and get a ton of treasures, or you can use it late game to fend off fatigue. It wasn't necessarily supposed to be heavily abused by, you know, Priest with Insight and Draconic Studies to get it out turn 5, Ramp Druid to get it out turn 5, and Dark Portal Warlock to get it out turn 5. I don't think it was intended to be that. And actually, all of those cards I just mentioned, all those combos, are actually rotating out with the next expansion. So if they bring back the power creep a little bit, have less mana cheat, and a little bit less ramp, I think that a lot more Kazakusan decks will be played along these lines, and I'm very excited for that. And overall, this deck is still a good deck. It's got like a 51% win rate on Hearthstone Replay. It's good against aggro decks. You've got tons of control with Shield Slams, Blade Storms, Minefield, the Shield Shatter, Brawl, Rancor, and the new Onyxian Drake. Very solid stuff. I highly recommend you guys check this deck out because it's just the most fun to me. And yeah, these are the decks I would recommend you playing. I will admit, some of the decks that were at the beginning of the list, like the aggro decks, are also higher up at the top because they're cheap, right? You don't have to put as much dust into them. And with the new expansion coming out in a month, maybe 2 at most, it does mean that a lot of cards are going to be rotating out. So you don't want to necessarily use a ton of dust right now, but if you want to climb, building one of those cheaper aggro decks is definitely fine. And for those of you who made it to the very end of the video, these are some budget options. For example, instead of Face Hunter, you can take out these 2 cards and run 2 Furious Howls. In aggro Druid, instead of running Drekthar, you could just run like another Mark of the Spike Shell. And instead of in aggro Priest, you could take out the 2 legendaries that weren't free, like Mankrik, and run 2 Tyrian Chaplains, which help you get early game tempo and pump up your minions and again solidify that board. And yeah, that's basically it. Just some cool little budget options for those of you who made it this far. Hopefully you guys enjoyed the video. I'll see you guys in the next one. I really like the meta right now. I mean, I'm not a huge fan, but I enjoy it more than, you know, the most ever since Quests came out, which is still pretty cool. And I'm excited to see what happens next year.